dear participants. So today is the 8th day of the 10-day lecture series, our course on Eurasian geopolitics, the new great game in Eurasia. Today the lecture is on multilateralizing old tensions in the new Asia, and the discussions will be on what is the geopolitical impact of these old tensions. Yesterday there were about 54 essay submissions, and the essays have already been evaluated by Professor Shabal. On Friday, he will comment on the essays, rather his remarks, his thoughts, and his suggestions. And some of the essays have been very, very impressive. One last call for submission. So today is the last day, although it's not wise to extend the deadline like this. But yes, those of you who are interested in submitting, and you better be interested because since you have registered for the course, it's a part and parcel of the process. So welcome again, Professor Shawal, to you. And dear participants, let's get ready for today's lecture. Over to you, Professor Shawal.
Thank you very much, Professor Upadhyay. Good morning to everybody. Namaste. And we indeed are going to be covering today the penultimate chapter in many, many ways. The last topic, number 10, is a sort of broad conclusion to the course. And today's topic is on the program Multilateralizing Old Tensions in the New Asia. And it is a topic which suggests that we address the issue of the multilateralization of New Asia's old tensions. And the adjective multilateral is a simple one, but the substance content of it is a complex one. But however complex, it is the key issue that we should be addressing. The issue of the multilateralization of the New Asia by the SCO is the same question as the question of the impact of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The word impact is also a very simple word, but it's very dense in content and tricky to analyze and use. I think the easiest approach to the concept of an impact is a contrario, or the counterfactual approach, and asking ourselves the question, what if not? What of the Asia in the post-Cold War had it not been for the emergence of the Shanghai construction? Where would we be today in the Sino post-Soviet, Central Asian, South Asian, so on, sphere, East Asian and West Asian sphere, without the existence of the SCO, and for that matter of a number of other organizations, which I have presented already twice, whether they were newly created in the 1990s and afterwards, or whether they were reactivated in that period of time. Now, of course, we cannot answer the question, what if not? We cannot guess what the present would be if the past had been different, but we can imagine what this would be. The reason why I insist on the concept of the impact or the consequence of the concrete multilateralization of the region is because when I first presented my research to a number of fora or colleagues, this is the question that came to me immediately. You know, you're talking about the New Asia, you're talking about the Shanghai construction, but concretely, what does it do, or what does it change? What is the impact of the construction? And this is a question that has been coming to me for the past 10 years or so, whether I present to colleagues in academic circles or whether I talk to practicing diplomats on occasions, rare occasions when I have them. And so in that sense, I have come to think that this is the only essential question. The question of the essence of the process, the essential question, and I use the word essential in the sense that Stephen Lukes used it for the power debate. What are we interested in when we talk about power? What is the essence of power? In his case, what is the essence of the Shanghai construction? And more generally, what is the essence of regions? What is a region? And so this brings us to the following approach in this chapter today, before I come to the paragraphs. Two questions that we should be able to answer, although they are difficult ones. Is the New Asia a region? And does the SCO contribute to the construction of Asia as a region? These are the two questions, or the research questions, if you wish, that we should keep in mind. Having said that, I have prepared 4 paragraphs which are on the screen. And so I wish to draw your attention to one word in each title of paragraphs for the time being, and pre-presenting the conclusion. Beyond peace and so on, the word beyond, the word despite, which means hurdles or obstacles that remain. The paragraph 3 is the most difficult one, examples of multilateralization, which means in essence proofs of the multilateralization, which is extremely difficult. And paragraph 4, the challenges that remain and the challenges that could jeopardize the process, so that could make the concepts of peace at the border and so on and so forth an illusion. And I will use in my conclusion, if you can scroll down the screen, my dear colleague, I will use in my conclusion a definition of a region borrowed from a colleague who provided it in the early 90s, and I use it because, as I will say, at the time he wrote it, the book and the definition of a region in his views, of a modern region, he couldn't have possibly in mind the Shanghai example because that was too early. Even the Shanghai Five at that time did not exist. So I find it particularly stimulating to suggest to you to use this early 90s definition for today's evaluation of the situation in the new Asia. That is the menu, so to speak, or the introduction to the course of today, to the chapter of today. I just wonder whether the link that I indicate in paragraph 4 is still active. If you click on the link, does it lead to something, or is it? No, it's unavailable. So I will have to comment and not use the link itself. So the first paragraph is entitled "Beyond Peace, Beyond Stability, Ambitions and Perspectives." And so in that paragraph, I wish to suggest that looking at a number of areas, looking at a number of sectors of cooperation, there is a very dynamic, active, progressive trend that has been ongoing for already some years or even decades. To introduce the paragraph 1, what exists today beyond the peace and the ambitions of the early years of the process, I wish to draw your attention to what I have suggested here, that a region is a project, a region is a vision, a region is an anticipated rationality in the making. It is a space made coherent by a project. That is my interactive definition, or part of the definition of a region. I have already on the screen, thanks to my dear colleague, put my sort of definition of a region many, many times, the one that concludes my ongoing article. And so this is my aim, in fact, to contribute through the New Asia and the Shanghai Cooperation as one illustration, among others, to better define what a region is, what the regional construction is all over the world. And so it is a concern that I have, an academic concern that goes beyond, of course, such illustration. So, but I think point A, clearly the process we're looking at has been able to go from border peace to cross-border transport continentalization. This is the word that I use, from border peace to cross-border transport continentalization or facilitation. And clearly what I mean here is that the original years and negotiations and efforts went to border peace, because at the time instability at the border or cross-border military skirmishes were possible if history had continued. And so not only was the preservation of borders, however, there are some remaining issues, I will come to them later, especially between China and Central Asia, has been a reality, but things never stopped there. This is my point, that as soon as one step was reached, the second step was envisaged, and so this was the demilitarization of the borders, and then very quickly the cross-border dynamics, meaning that, as elsewhere in the world, borders become functional entities, no longer lines of absolute separation, and they conceive of themselves as facilitating the passage through the border. What the Europeans call free movements is the concept we use, but this is the equivalent exists elsewhere. Clearly in West Africa, if you look at the construction of the West African economic zone, where the exact name is Economic Community of West African States, and the other one is the Economic and Monetary Union of West Africa. If you look at the way they work and operate, they operate in the sense that borders remain, of course, as administrative and fiscal and lines of distinction, but they're no longer points of blockage, at least in Europe and West Africa. The same applies to any common markets or trading zones in Latin America or elsewhere. So borders change their nature in that sense. Peace at the border, even demilitarization, is not the end of the process. There is always a next step suggested, sometimes difficult, sometimes there is a reversal on the process. But so this is a way also to go from high diplomacy to applied logistical cooperation. And what characterizes the expression from border peace to cross-border transport continentalization is the fact that the concrete next step was the transportation of goods, cross-border investments, but in particularly the building of infrastructure to facilitate the transport of goods and of energy across the borders. So to conclude on this point, if we were to go back in history and look at the issue of the borders, I repeat, the main examples I have in mind is China and Central Asia. What the border situation was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and so on, we'd see how marked a change there has been taking place in that sector. The point B is called from security concerns to trading and financial goals. So not only do we go from security issues, some of them classic security issues, even hard security issues, to economic dynamics, but we go from concerns to goals. We go from immediate preoccupations that could lead to destabilization to very ambitious goals for the future. So the present becomes open, and the future is indeed, as some sociologists call it, an open present, or an extended present. This is really, of course, illustrated by the creation within the Shanghai process of the Business Council and of the Interbanking Association, even though the names have changed slightly. But beyond the specific details of what I have in mind, we indeed are seeing a process where the neighbors become partners in the sense of having not only an incentive and a willingness perhaps to solve as many issues as they can or concerns as they can, but they go to having very ambitious, open-ended and sometimes long-term goals to turn the region into a prosperous trading zone, whether a customs union or whether some other form of a trading agreement. So there is, again, with the expressions from to, a sort of dynamic which I wish to underline. The third point, point C, from concerns for three evils to crisis management capabilities. Here again we have a dynamic process that goes from a situation to another situation, from what I call a concern for three evils, mentioned and defined early on in the charter of the organization in 2002, which you have all read, some of you more than others, but still, you have read the charter. And those evils, of course, at the time, covering international terrorism or the fight against it, and covering the risk of territorial separatism and the risk of the process of political activism or radicalism. At the time, 2002, especially in the wake of 2001 and the attacks of September on the USA, were at the time really perceived as the full story or the full menu. If the new members of the organization were able to cooperate against those three evils, that would be enough. I mean, that would be just already a huge achievement in the face of their previous relations. and in the face of the new perceived international dominant instability, which was international terrorism. The fight against those three evils has been substantiated, of course, and led to a number of decisions, definitions, legal regime impositions, and concrete actions, especially in the framework of the RATS, Regional Association for regional anti-terrorist structure, but more widely and much more widely, this has led to what I call crisis management capabilities in the form of the joint military exercises. And the name of these exercises we've mentioned 2 days ago or 3 days ago are peace missions or anti-terror missions. So the names indicate exactly what they are targeting, so to speak. They're targeting part of the three evils, but they are exercises that intend to test one thing, and one thing mainly, that is the concrete operational capability or capacity to deploy troops and to act upon a certain type of danger at the time. And they are, if you go through the tables that I shared with you, each of these exercises is specifically designed to test a capability to fight in mountain areas, over long distances, at night, at day, in different circumstances, which are of course different circumstances the military are used to train in, because they need to be all round capable of acting. But they are situations designed to fight against the dangers that are contained in these three so-called evils. But beyond the crisis management capability within one organization, this trend, this dynamism has evolved into the other organization, which is the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and the fact that the two conduct simultaneously, sometimes together, military exercises is a case in point to suggest that we've gone from something which I would suggest to call more narrow, although the three evils are not a narrow point, to something which is a much more wider concern and capability to maintain peace. Incidentally, I checked recently, and unless I'm grossly mistaken, these military exercises have already associated new members, including India and Pakistan. So the question that we discussed last week, we should perhaps pick up again. But I'm not into the details of things. I'm just, in this first paragraph, suggesting that things have gone beyond themselves, that there is a dynamism, a progressive construction, which clearly has characterized a period of time which is short. If you go back to 96, 2001, it's 25 years, 30 years. If you start in 2002, 2003, it's even less. So in 2 decades, we've gone from the absence of a capacity or capability or agreement or will or common concern to a real capacity to be among partners capable of certain types of actions. And this testing, I used the word test some days ago to suggest that until a test is actually met and realized and overcome, we cannot say whether the efficiency of such or such a structure is real, but perhaps we don't need the test as such if there are some operational exercises conducted, but not only in the military. There's also a progressive construction involving the banking agreements and the financial sectors and the trading centers and the logistical transportation sector in general. That being said, we should look at paragraph 2, which begins with the word despite. This has happened despite, of course, enduring bilateralisms and the difficulty of multilateralization of the situation. There are points to be mentioned that are part of this paragraph, which suggest that we should not stop at the existing or the existence of institutions. We should ask ourselves the questions of what are the impediments or the limitations of what is on paper progressing as I've just suggested it is. And there are three series of impediments, enduring bilateralisms, which I have indicated as through some examples. We need to go beyond those examples, I think. Point B will be specifically enduring Sino-Russian rivalry, although this is the topic for chapter 9 mainly, but I will mention it today briefly. And point C will be the redefinition by us today of multilateralization as the manifestation of a collective preference, and the expressions collective preference will be part of the conclusion and definition of a region by my colleague Zaki Laidi. So first of all, of course, there are enduring bilateralisms and enduring bilateral tensions. And in fact, this is what has been coming to me from you all the time over the past few days. The bilateral difficult situation or rivalry between China and Russia, the relation between India and Pakistan, the relation between China and India, and also the tensions between, on the one hand, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and on the other hand, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, which we have mentioned and which I will go back to. But on many occasions, your remarks and questions as to the limitations of the improvement of relations among neighbors have echoed in my mind examples that I've taken from Europe or from the European space. Have we been devoid of tensions over the past half century? The answer is no. I have mentioned a number of them. I have mentioned the Franco-Spanish fishing problems. I could mention, although it is not strictly within the EU, but in that connection, the tension between Greece and Turkey, and enduring tensions which were on paper solved not by the European construction, but by the Montego Bay Treaty, which provided four sub-solutions of international law regarding maritime affairs. And we have a number of other enduring tensions. Some tension that could have been very difficult to manage between Poland and Germany regarding the border was solved early on, because the very first decision that was taken immediately after the Cold War was the fixation of the Oder-Neisse border between Germany and Poland. But if you look at the case of Europe, there are a number of so-called enduring bilateral tensions. We have a bilateral tension between France and England regarding the crossing of the channel by illegal immigrants. And we have a number of such tensions. Now, you could argue that we are not with tensions that contain the risk of military open conflict. But we have a number of situations which are little talked about, which is precisely contestations of the present borders. There are movements in certain countries of Europe which claim that there is a case for going back in history and change the border again, because it was changed not so long ago at the detriment of one. But this is an issue, I will give you some examples, but this is an issue for some political parties. Within the political game, some parties in their programs claim that if they come to power, they will act in such a way. We have this issue between Germany and Denmark. The border at present was moved north when German or Prussian power made it possible, and the previous border was the Elbe River that runs through Hamburg, and that is much further south than the present German the Danish border. And we have nostalgic thinkers who would like to go back even further in time. Now, if you go back in time, anywhere in the world, you go back in time to situations where the borders were different. So how far to go back, whether to go back, and how to manage the existing situation is always very difficult. So the tensions I mentioned for this region, China, Russia, India, Pakistan, China, India, I will not detail because you are more knowledgeable than I am, and the one tension or rivalry between China and Russia I will look at in the next chapter. But let me again go back to the tensions between among Central Asian states. I mentioned it before, but let's do it more systematically, not very long, but more systematically. When I say Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan on the one hand and Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan on the other hand, I mean the difference, which is a simple one, between upstream countries and downstream countries, where the upstream countries have hydro resources available and stock them in the summer to use them in the winter to produce hydroelectric power, when the downstream countries need the water for irrigation and more for urban and consumer use all year round, but especially in the summer for irrigation. And the tensions have been extremely high, to the point of military threats or indirect military threats among some countries. The downstream country signaling that it was ready to go to military action if the upstream country were to continue building a dam or building a reservoir holding the water. And this indirectly also concerns Turkmenistan, which is further down the line and further west, but also a downstream country for a number of rivers, such as the Amudarya and the Sirdarya, which are the two main rivers in the region, that end up in the Aral Sea, which is almost dried up. And these issues of cross-border water resources could easily have become already, or could still to some extent be, casus belli, cases of war, or reasons to go to war, or reasons to actually engage in open military conflict. And so this example is particularly relevant in the region because it has an origin, which is a very simple one, a very complex one. I mean, simple to mention, but not easy to understand for us, perhaps, and as a solution, which I've mentioned before, which could be the key to the building of the region. The origin of the problem is that until 1991, the cross-border water issues were managed by a federal Soviet body from Moscow, and Moscow decided how much water was given or retained or shared and not shared, and eventually what compensations were given to countries that wanted water and should give some compensations or other types of resources to the country that had water. And that disappeared overnight. We have to understand that things changed overnight. Late December 2091, suddenly all the regulating bodies, all the regulating institutions disappeared. So certainly those countries had to find a way to deal with their needs and resources. And the first way to deal with them was a sort of national, quote-unquote, selfish way to grab what was available and not immediately engage in cooperation. But this is not within the Shanghai Cooperation as such directly, but a number of attempts have been made to, until now, that came from actors I refer to sometimes as the providers of something. So there have been some World Bank, European Union, UN, some experts or bodies or advisors that have gone to the region and suggested some solutions. And we are seeing progress in the recent years only. The progress has been realized not much longer than 4 or 5 years since the change of leadership in Uzbekistan that has addressed the issue differently, and the changes in the leadership of some of these countries. But now they are working towards something which could one day become, it's too early yet, but a common management of the cross-border water issues. What I've suggested to call perhaps a Central Asian water community, that could be the equivalent for that region to the European and coal community in Europe, which I've mentioned before. And so besides the cross-border water issues along the borders between the countries I've mentioned, South Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, we have the symbol or the example of the Aral Sea, which is very interesting. To date, what has been taking place is the rebuilding of a dam situated near the village of Kokaral, which was financed by the World Bank initially to a certain height, and recently the dam was built even higher using international financing, but to some extent joint financing by the countries, and to the effect that the north of the Aral Sea is now not fully replenished, but to some extent replenished, and this is a demonstration that the technical solution does exist, at least to some extent, for solving the RC situation, which would impact not only the economy, the demography, the socio-economic reality of the villages situated around it, but also impact positively the climatic rain regime in the region. So I focus on one example because it is perhaps less known to you than the other ones that are on the right on the screen. But of course, I wish to completely do away here with the idea that when we talked about the Shanghai construction, we're talking only about solutions or progress or simple closing of tensions. There are a number of tensions that endure, that are still lasting, but as I said, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, there is a trend that has been launched, and that trend is, my hypothesis, will lead to results. The time factor is an uncertain one, but the progress in the relations, I think, is a high hypothesis. The next point is the enduring Sino-Russian rivalry, which we will look at in chapter 9 in some more details. But what I wish to underline here briefly, because time is passing, is the contrast of the situation today vis-à-vis the past. We should not underlook the situation that has existed between the mid-50s and the late 50s and the late 80s, early 90s, the better part of 40 years, 45 years, of extreme tension, and the closing of the borders and the real military escalation along the borders between those two countries or regimes that were part of the same bloc of the Cold War. But irrespective of that, the tension was extremely high, to the point that I've said before, where intervention by one into the other was a suggestion that was taken very seriously. By contrast to that, what has been happening since 1991 is very striking. Tensions of the past have been turned into cooperation, and it is something which I say because I've read your essays, and most of the essays point to the fact that the Shanghai construction is a construction by China and Russia, and some others. I will make a comment on that when I make a comment on the essay. So I think those two countries are a clear illustration of the way in which two states, two entities, although one has gone from a federal Soviet regime to a Russian republic, of course that is a meaningful change, but the key, okay, if you call it Beijing and Moscow, then those two actors have been able to reverse completely that type of interaction to create something completely new, which is a multilateral organization which they co-founded, in which they believe very strongly because they are entrusted with the possibility of creating common economic cooperation, prosperity, and so on and so forth. And this is a striking alteration of the previous diplomatic situation, but also a striking alteration of the geopolitical perception by the two actors. The fact that they are rivals is logical and will not go away because they are both, in their geopolitical history, continental powers. I explained this in more details yesterday. The fact that they are also with maritime ambitions is similar, so they have the same characteristics, the same similar ambitions, and the same ways in many ways to build on their power and to assert their power. But they do it in a different context. They do it, and the context matters very much. The context is no longer the Cold War. The context is no longer the uncertainty transition after the Cold War. The context is one in which, at the same time, a region, or all regions, this one, for example, is building itself, and at the same time trying to become a competitor for the other regions in the world. So what supersedes, in many, many ways, what transcends any yet enduring Sino-Russian tension or rivalry. What supersedes or transcends it is the fact that they together have no choice but somehow to be able to compete on the world stage for whatever are the present power factors on the world stage. So they have to be somehow economically credible, energetically credible, and credible in their construction of a new entity, even though that entity is not clearly yet defined. And the way in which this entity is not yet defined is through the Eurasian dimension. And here we don't have time to go into the details, but at the same time as those two countries are both calling themselves Eurasian or somehow finding the Eurasian dimension relevant to their geopolitical ambitions, they do not have the same approach to what Eurasian means. Basically, for Russia, it's the definition of its specificity. Eurasian is not neither West nor East, it's not both West and East, it's specifically different and Russian. And for China, Eurasian means basically connecting to the west of the continent and connecting in concrete logistical transport corridors to the rest of the continent. So there are a number of enduring situations which are not solved by the Shanghai construction and which are not meant to be solved in the sense of being done away with, but that are part of the broad picture and the broad context that is, irrespective of this enduring dynamics, a context that is changing. Paragraph 3 is on examples of multilateralization, the so-called proofs of what this could be, what is the impact of the new Asia. And here we enter very difficult ground where we should tread very carefully. I will use in point A a counterfactual approach by mentioning what I call the non-intervention. How can non-intervention be an illustration of the impact of the Shanghai construction in the following manner? The Charter clearly says on many different places that the countries should respect each other's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and so on and so forth, which means not intervene. So long as they don't intervene, they are respecting the Charter, and in that sense the Charter is constructing the region, if you follow my train of thought. And there have been non-interventions to date on many occasions, with one example we have mentioned before. The 2005 situation in Uzbekistan, the Andijan crisis. I mentioned again the 2010 tension in Kyrgyzstan, in the Osh region and near the Kyrgyz-Uzbek border. I'll mention again to characterize them, and then we'll mention some others. So what happened in 2005 is that a major socio-economic or socio-political crisis took place, the cause of which is economic tensions among basically the poorer classes and the more prosperous classes. And more specifically, what happened is that a number of employers or firm leaders were imprisoned on charges of misconduct. But being imprisoned, they could no longer offer the jobs and pay the salaries of their workers, and therefore the workers found themselves completely left out, and they demonstrated for deliberation from the custody of those employers, not on political grounds, but on simple family economic grounds, that they wanted to get the job back. But the ensuing reaction of the government was a police strong intervention, and there were some victims in that context. So there ensued an instability in the regime, in the country, and that instability very interestingly led some leaders to consider calling for the intervention of not the STO, because the STO doesn't intervene, but the CSTO, which is not the same organization, but which has as a strong initiator Russia, which is also a strong heavyweight in the SCO. And Russia itself, through the SCO, would have been perhaps very much in favor of demonstrating a capacity to bring back order. So the temptation to call for intervention on the part of the government of Uzbekistan and the temptation to intervene on the part of the governments of the countries was there. Yet there was no intervention because specifically the philosophy of non-intervention, which comes from the SCO was indirectly applied, or indirectly taken into consideration as regards the CSTO. In 2010, similarly, there was a socio-economic crisis consisting basically of the fact that some, let's call them ethnic groups, the term is accepted in this region, I don't like it from our region, but still, or some community-based tensions occurred between some underprivileged and often unemployed and badly housed groups and the more prosperous other groups that came from a different community. But in modern terms, these were all Kyrgyzstanis. They all had a Kyrgyzstani passport, so they were all citizens of the country. But some were of Kyrgyz ethnic origin, some were of Uzbek ethnic origin. So clashes took place on socioeconomic grounds, the poor or the underprivileged manifesting their anger are the more prosperous. This was interpreted as an ethnic conflict, and as a result, many of the Kyrgyzstani ethnic Uzbeks moved to the border of Uzbekistan, wanting to enter Uzbekistan, the home country or the motherland, to seek shelter and refuge. And this was refused by Uzbekistan on the grounds that they did not have an Uzbekistani passport, but they had a Kyrgyzstani passport. And again, there ensued instability in the country, in the regime, and for the similar reasons, intervention was considered by the government and was considered perhaps by the Russian logical temptation to play a greater role than had been the case since 1991. And yet intervention did not happen for the same reasons. And so I see these cases of non-interventions are proofs that there is an impact of the philosophy of the SCO on the conduct of the states, because if intervention is provided for explicitly for the CSTO and perhaps implicitly for the SCO, it's vis-à-vis third parties, states or governments of countries located outside the CSTO space or the SCO space. Now we could go on and mentioning the crises that have been taking place since the last 2 or 3 decades. But similarly, there was no intervention in that sense, except for the January 2022 case of Kazakhstan, which I have said in a perhaps imperfect way, it is the exception that confirms the rule. Point 2 is the what I call the consensualization as forced, quote-unquote, forced multilateralization. Of course, I'm playing on words. I'm picking up the word consensus that exists in the charter of the SCO and building a reasoning from the mention of that so-called decision-making procedure. Article 16 of the SCO Charter, which you have read and which you should read again, mentions the decision-taking procedure. It is a fairly long article, considering that the Charter is, in total, is not very long. And it is interesting in the sense that if we read it with a critical eye, it suggests that there is a multilateralization which is, so to speak, the starting point and the ending point of the ways in which the members interact. I read the Charter. The SCO bodies shall take decisions by agreement without vote. So it's not just only by agreement, it's specifically without vote, and the decisions shall be considered adopted if no member raised objections. During the vote or the consensus, decisions are considered to be taken if there is no objection to them. Section 2. Any member state may expose its opinion on particular aspects of concrete issues or decisions, but if he opposes them, so to speak, that will not be an obstacle to taking the decision. Similarly, states are free to decide not to participate in the consequences of the decisions or in the decisions, if I interpret the text, but their non-participation will not prevent the implementation of the cooperation projects. In other words, there is a degree to which the critical approach could suggest that disagreement or unwillingness to agree with the decision is basically ineffective on the decision. There is a critical interpretation of many observers of the Charter, hence the word in my presentation of forced multilateralization. In other words, countries that may be in disagreement with the decision don't really have a means to see that disagreement lead the way to the decision not being taken. On the other hand, if we adopt a less critical view and a more constructive view, we could suggest that this particular mode of decision-making, which by the way exists in other organizations, not just in the SCO, unless I'm mistaken again, it's the same in ASEAN, please double check for me. This mode of decision-making, which de facto suggests that there is no veto right for a member of the organization, is perhaps the price to pay for efficiency. It's a price to pay for efficiency in the context of the years 2000s and 2010s and today, in order to act quickly, in order to be able to progress in the decisions that have to be taken at the origin of the organizations regarding fundamental issues of security and the fight against the three evils and the fights against the next two evils, which are drug trafficking and human trafficking in many, many ways. So whether this is to be criticized or taken as a characteristic of the construction, I suggest the latter is perhaps more relevant. And this is a way in which, if I quote from a French author, Garot, the way in which the country is concerned pursue their interests, and the way to pursue one's interests in a region is specific and different from one region to the other region. The result of this process, as far as we're concerned, is that there is a capacity to take decisions on difficult matters that has been provided for by the Charter and implemented in the following years and decades. In particular, point C now, there has been a capacity to conceptualize and adopt and practice a common security or a common conception of security. And the important word here is common. Whenever something is common or commonly agreed upon or commonly characteristic of the historic change, it is relevant to understanding what is happening. So those countries, those members, plus the extra, the new members that have come into the picture, India, Pakistan, Iran, and Belarus, share to some extent a common security conception, at least within the SCO context. And that common security clearly is characterized by 2 points. One is that appeasement, in as much as possible, is a better solution than aggressivity. And the second point is that cooperation, when it exists, should yield to a multiplication, diversification of the forms of cooperation. So not only on hard security, but on economic security, economic cooperation, and even cultural identity of the region. The rolling snowball effect, or the multiplying dynamic, that suggested to me some time ago now to work on these issues with the concept of integrative cooperation, halfway between integration and cooperation, as I've said to you before. So to conclude on paragraph 3, it is not easy, it is even very difficult to prove for certain that multilateralization has taken place, but we can go back to one of my first points. By contrast to what would be the situation today without the existing organizations, and for that matter, the SCO and others, there has been a progress. And secondly, more concretely, some crises or some tensions have taken place, which have not escalated as much as they could have, perhaps, without this construction over the past few decades. There remains paragraph 4, challenges, there remains limitations, there remains causes for more than the limitations, the cancellation perhaps of multilateralization in the region we're looking at. We are looking at a history in the making, that's the expression of Raymond Aron, l'histoire se faisant. We're looking at history in the making in the sense that the determinants, the factors, the forces at play are themselves still in evolution. We cannot look at the process yet as historians. I don't know when we'll be able to look at it as historians. I have suggested to you that there is a SCO1 until 2015-17 and an SCO2. So I think as historians we can, or not us, we're not historians, but historians could look at the period 96-2001, 2015-17 and characterize what has happened. And of course, since the enlargement to 4 new members, which is going from 6 to 4, it's almost a doubling of members, is a new historical period. But we have a number of enduring or challenges that exist. First, water issues, Eurasian ambiguity, and migration issues. And I have touched already upon the first 2, so I'll be very brief. But I insist, and I insist with the view that when we have the discussion, you and I together mentioned this suggestion that I have regarding the water issues and the cross-border water issues and water issues in general. What I could add to the discussion I've already launched is the fact that there are 2 or 3 new factors that come into play when we look at water issues. One is demographic expansion. Those countries are, some of them rapidly expanding in their population, reaching numbers which for you in India look a little minute, but which are not. The one country that has doubled its population almost is Tajikistan, nearing, please double check on the internet, going from 4 or 5 millions to over 9 millions today. Kyrgyzstan has also expanded the population by at least 50% since the last 30 years. Turkmenistan, moderately so, has gone from 4, 5, 6, 7 millions, roughly speaking, I quote from memory. Kazakhstan has gone from 15 to 17, 18, 19, which is not a marked change. And Uzbekistan, the largest population, 35 million, is now in the region of nearly 40 million. So minute numbers for you. But if you take them all together, there is a significant demographic increase in those countries, and therefore a heavier demand on water for consumption, plus on irrigation for agriculture and the production of food. The second factor is urbanization. There is, of course, as in many countries of the world, a process of urbanization when more and more people live in the cities, and in the cities people consume or are more dependent on collective water than they are perhaps in the countryside to some extent. So demography, urbanization, and of course lifestyle, which is of course all over the world with development and more people consume more drinking waters as they become more prosperous. So this is an additional element to the water issue. The rest I have said, and of course I should add as a third factor or as a fourth factor, the industrialization. Those countries are also industrializing very rapidly, some more than others, but clearly Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. But Kazakhstan has a different situation in terms of water resources because of the north of the country, but industrialization, so demography, urbanization, and industrialization. So all these point to the direction for a number of additional factors, which I stick to, and I would like us to discuss it, that if those countries were able to devise a concrete form of unionizing, so to speak, they would invent a water management community of Central Asia. Beyond diplomatic necessary apparatus, which now exists, is the Central Asian Forum. The Central Asian Forum as a container could devise a content that would be a Central Asian water management community. Next point is the ambiguity of the Eurasian term and the Eurasian solution. There is, as I've said many times already before, a Russian, a Chinese, even a Central Asian approach to Eurasianism. But is there a SCO vision of Eurasianism? The short answer is no, because that would perhaps, from the point of view of the founding members, limit the scope of the SCO to Eurasia, whereas clearly the scope of the SCO today through its affiliates is also the Middle East, Eastern Africa, and more the Indian Ocean. So whether this is a relevant or difficult point or not, I'm not quite sure. But if as some philosophers say, idealism exists, in the sense that ideas lead the world. We know that leaders and nations need concepts, and sometimes abstract concepts, to progress in their togetherness, in their commonality. So if a concept such as a clear neo-definition of Asia exists, or if a clear concept such as a neo-definition of Eurasia exists, it can only make it easier for countries to cooperate and partnerize than if they disagree even of their on the immediate geographic identity or the immediate sub-regional cohesion. There is also, by way of discussion here, a European vision of Eurasia, and I think to some extent, in that sense, a Southeast Asian vision of Eurasia, which are different from the other ones that I've mentioned. The European and Southeast Asian visions is embodied in the ASEM dialogue. There is a way in which, at the time in '96 and in the immediate post-Cold War, the ASEM dialogue meant something which is very, I think, clearly illustrated by the maps. If you look at the map of the continent and use one color for the EU and for the ASEAN, you see that in between those two, in cartographic ways, in between the two, you have the future or the existing SCO members. In between the color for the EU and the color for the ASEAN, you have China, Russia, and the others. So in cartographic ways, Eurasia, what it means for the Europeans and for the Southeast Asians, is what is not the other New Asia. The other New Asia is the Sino-post-Soviet Central Asia. So I stop here because this is an academic discussion, but my point is that when it is possible to have a common label, New Asia, Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, that common label facilitates things to some extent among members. The last point is the issue of migrations, and I think migrations, which are a challenge to the cohesion of the region, migrations are an extremely, I say this to potential PhD researchers, are an extremely relevant forum to approach international relations and tensions, because migrations contain all. They contain the issue of economic disparities and economic needs to migrate to find labor. They contain the legal and illegal aspects of migrations. They contain the capacity of states to control or not their borders and to agree on what to do with the migrants, legal or illegal migrants, and they agree what to do with measures that facilitate or restrict the possibility of crossing borders. And they concern, to a large extent, international relations in the sense of multilateral relations, not just bilateral relations, because often migrants cross a number of borders. In the case that we're looking at Central Asia, migrants from Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan cross the border into Kazakhstan and then the border into Russia. And there has been a number of ways in which those countries have adopted for some time a de facto regime of not facilitating, but not preventing as much as they could migrations, because if they had, they would have prevented some of them, the poorer countries, from the remittances sent by the workers once they have migrated. So to some extent there was a way in which, so long as the workers were qualified and bringing a necessary workforce to the target country, and so long as they behaved in that country well enough and did not become political opponents or whatever, they were more tolerated than what the legal provisions said. That has been, of course, changed markedly within the Eurasian Economic Union, because the Eurasian Economic Union, which was formally completed and launched in 2015, has a free movement of people philosophy in it, free movement of people and capital and goods, the same vocabulary as in European construction, which means that there is no longer any work permit to some extent, but no longer visas or travel permits to cross the borders. The time is 11:28, which means I have 2 minutes. Thank you very much. So I'll stop here to suggest that migrations are also, like water, a very, very relevant way to approach these issues. Are there still some migration problems in the region of the Central Asian at large? Yes, but are they monitored in a way which is clearly conducive to stabilization? Yes. Because beyond the formal provisions of the Eurasian Economic Union, there are also within the SCO philosophy a tendency to encourage whatever can facilitate the development and prosperity of the member states, and if what is necessary is a degree of labor migrations to complement the workforce and to bring workers where they are necessary, it is done. So in conclusion, I'd like to briefly look at the answer to the question that I asked at the beginning. Two questions I said: is the new Asia a region, and does the SCO construction make Asia a region? The answer to that question I take from the definition of a region, which was suggested in 1998 by Zaki Laidi, who wrote a number of books on the new meaning of the world in the post-Cold War, or the new restructuring of world power. And he is the author who suggested the phrase that I've used in this classroom last week, that regions are becoming the units of analysis of the world dynamics. So he suggests to define a region or a process of region making in the following manner: 3 points ABC. The establishment of a deliberative space in which both public and private actors intervene to pose and solve problems, calling for common solutions to this space. The production of collective preferences specific to this space but situated in the global game, and the ability to convert these preferences and deliberations into political performances or actions. And I separate the definition in 3 parts, which is not what he does, but this is what I do, to suggest 3 steps, that going from step 1 to step 2 and step 3 is a process. Having reached all 3 steps is a moment when the region is completed or fully created, and so on and so forth. So have the SCO member states reached the capacity to establish a deliberative space? Yes, through their annual meetings and declarations, in which both public and private actors intervene. Yes, because there are public actors, of course, and also to some extent private actors, which is the business world in general, able to pose and solve problems, to actually to call a spade, to say what the problem is, and suggest solutions, however limited solutions may be in its implications. And the common solutions, the commonality factor, I think clearly is there. Point B, have the SCO member states been able to produce collective preferences specific to this space, but situated in the global game? In other words, to phrase and even adopt or practice collective preferences. Preferences meaning preferred courses of action by contrast to previous courses of action. The answer to me is yes. Relevant to their own problems, solutions that make sense, preferences that make sense for themselves, but also preferences that make them able to level off or to engage in a successful competition with other regions in the world. The third point is the one where we could suggest things are still progressing: the capacity to convert preferences, point B, and deliberations, point A, into performances and actions. And if we suggest that this fully realized would be what the Europeans called common policies, then to some extent this is not yet the case. So to make a long story short, step 1, step 2, in my view, are completed. Step 3 is in the making, and will take some time because you phrase it in European terms. Again, I think the SCO has embarked much more on enlargement over the last 5 years or so, or 5-10 years, than on deepening. And the deepening, of course, is the evolution more conducive to common policies. I stopped before time yesterday. I'm stopping a little after time today. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. article what is a geopolitical impact, and the key word, as you know, is impact. So I will say a few things, but clearly I would like us to discuss, especially the points that I've indicated in the first hour as barely touched upon by me today, and more within your field of expertise and consequence. And before I come to the whiteboard, this arrow there is supposed to be a sort of summary of the course, a link or a relation between certain factors which we need to make more clear. So I will suggest a few elements of answer to the question, what is a geopolitical impact, ending with concrete aspects and starting with more qualitative and even more epistemological points. I will answer the question in two ways, from the point of view of epistemology and from the point of view of sociopolitics. I think the first answer is epistemological, in the sense that before we decide to address the issue of what is an impact, how can change take place, what is change, what is transition, what is new, indeed, what does new mean, we are into epistemology. What is epistemology? It is a reflection upon knowledge. It is a way in which we assess whether the knowledge we are producing when we do research has validity or not, whether knowledge is biased, whether knowledge is fraud or imperfect or eventually useless or relevant. If it is relevant, then it should be of such a type that we use it as a tool to understand better reality. But I think within epistemological considerations, some of them are subjective and some of them are perhaps more or will be objective. Within the subjective approach to my research topic, which is the substance matter of this course, I would see three aspects. First, the perception of self. The perception of self, then the perception of the other, and then the mode of affirmation. This is indeed at the heart of our considerations. What is the perception of self by citizens of a country, by leaders of one particular country, or by leaders together of a region? How do they perceive of themselves? And the answer to the region we're looking at is that for the first time in 1991, they, in Central Asia, started perceiving themselves as what the words sovereign, independent, and so on mean, but in my approach, capable of decisions that were independent and that were going to lead to consequences under their own control. Decisions that were independent and going to lead to results and to consequences under their own control. And that was entirely new, and there was a necessary moment of adaptation. And I think in that respect, the historical context was conducive to the fact that those leaders, presidents of the countries, were able to achieve transitions, is the fact that they were in power before. Had they been entirely new to power in 1991, perhaps they would have been less able to assume the transition decisions, and we have a number of East European countries where the leaders were historical figures, but when they came to power, they were inexperienced, and so experience played a part. Perception of self took the direction of nationalistic, even to some extent, stance, logically so. The first step in reconstructing the self is to be self-centered, nationalistic in the sense. That is clearly a characteristic which cannot be avoided, but whether it leads to closing in nationalism or to establish nationalism with others is the question. And what happened in that region is that all countries went through a national nation building, even nationalistic to some extent, phase, but that didn't last long, and that did not prevent common perceptions to be addressed. The second point is the perception of the other, how those nations of Central Asia perceived the other or the others, one of them being the former Federation of the Soviet Union, so Russia, and the other being the neighbors, especially China, and the other being more distant, the West. Their differences occurred, I've explained this to you before. Some countries tended to align on Russia spontaneously and lastingly. Others hesitated and aligned on different world actors. But the perception of the other was immediately one of complementarity in terms of economics and trade. It was immediately perceived that the only way to reconstruct the countries economically was to partnerize prosperous actors of international trade. And so massive investments took place in the countries. The economic dynamic was separate to some extent from the political one. And then the mode of affirmation, the ways in which those countries affirmed themselves was very different for almost one generation, from 1991, 1992 to the mid-2010s, and has changed since in the sense of partially, that's my hypothesis, under the dynamic of the Shanghai construction, but also having reached for themselves a macroeconomic state of development, affirm themselves both vis-à-vis the rest of the world and among themselves. So in terms of the subjective construction, what is the most delicate point is the degree of togetherness that those countries' leaders feel, or the degree of competition among themselves. And we are, in my perception, at the present, at the threshold of these two evolutions. Now, objectively speaking, what realization have taken place, what progress can be mentioned, and how much implementation is there of new measures in those countries and in that region? Well, objectively speaking, the realization of those regimes clearly is that they have reconstructed their economy and managed to conduct a multi-ethnic or multinational, multicultural construction of the nation, which was difficult because, as I explained, the communities that came from outside the region were recent ones. There were communities that had come to those countries, not exclusively, but many of them during the 20th century, and therefore the nation to be reconstructed in the late 20th century was very different from the nation that pre-existed the Soviet system. There has been, secondly, much progress in the development of those countries, especially Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, in classic macroeconomic indicators of development, GNP, and most relevant insertion into the export mechanisms or export circuits of the world trade. That is an easy point to suggest. Now, implementation of new reforms, implementation of decisions is not yet complete, obviously, but that is the case for any country in the world that goes through a transition. What interests me is that when we talk about the policies pursued by those governments, we are already with a mix of policies that are clearly national ones and policies that are regional ones. The most progress that has been reached concerns the security of the region, not yet the next point, and I'm going to look at the socio-political development. But again, this is the discussion I would like to have with you, is that the difficult question of what would be the situation today had there not been the developments, the agreements, and the diplomatic construction of the past 30 years, we should ask ourselves the questions. Now, in terms of sociopolitics, two short points. I think it is very interesting in a more concrete manner that the evolution of those countries is both in many ways nation-based, but also common to the countries concerned. My own experience of the past years visiting those countries is that still until the 2010s and even before, it was difficult to come across the suggestion in those countries that they had much in common. There was a long period of about 10-15 years where the course pursued was independent of each other. Clearly, they felt that the independence made more sense in the possibility of linking to partners and actors outside the region than within the region. This has changed, and in many, many ways, we could suggest that this is the result of two things. First of all, I repeat, having reached for some of them a degree of socio-economic economic development sufficient, they are now considering that the neighbor is a logical partner, even in economic terms. But also, there is an impact of the collective construction of the organizations, especially the Eurasian Economic Union, which does not comprise all countries of the region, which has created a degree of imbalance in the economies of those countries, but which is today a reference to commonality, to cross-border commonality, even though there have been some negative impacts of the early formation of the Eurasian Economic Union, in the sense that certainly tariffs were lifted, and so the real competition among products was revealed, and some products were not competitive in some countries, and so imports from the other member states of the Union took over the national productions in those categories. But there is now much more and more commonality pursued and perceived in those countries. But again, this is a debated concept which we might touch upon. And the last point is that in terms of sociopolitics, beyond the national or the national level or the level of the dynamics among those countries, there is a truly international level to be looked at. And so, what has changed in that rapport between the region of Central Asia and the rest of the world, I think, in my perception, is that the region, not only by itself, but with, of course, the neighbors of China, Russia, and now India and others, is engaged in a world competition for power, which is the history of the world ever since it was created. They are no longer feeling that they are essentially characterized by their dependence upon the rest of the world, which they were for some of them in the 90s, because they wanted to detach themselves from the Chinese potential domination and the former Soviet or Russian partner. And my perception is that today these countries are very much becoming aware of their capacity to be a credible actor on the world stage, a power competition. Clearly so in terms of energy resources, clearly so in terms of some other rare metals or certain substances that are precious to the rest of the world, like uranium we mentioned. But beyond energy, in terms of the capacity to be, and this will be my last word for this presentation, an Asia that can say no, a different Asia that can say no from the original location where this coin phrase was invented, which was Southeast Asia and later East Asia, as I said last week. The Asia that can say no, which is not in a sense, which in my words, a negative or aggressive statement, but a statement of affirmation. In other words, clearly the question of the centrifugal characteristics still exists, but has become much more nuanced today than before. There is a degree to which, even if I anticipate on the realpolitik or real diplomacy, there is a way in which that region is now able to engage the rest of the world and not be, what's the word, to be neo-dependent upon the rest of the world. So now we can have a discussion and questions. I've left many points open. I'm leaving this on the screen because it is both a very dated, Western, imperfect, perhaps limited definition, where the author had obviously in mind Europe, or the European construction. Sorry?
Eurocentric.
Huh?
Eurocentric.
Yes, yes. Well, at least Europe-based. Eurocentric to me means that this vision would be first valid for Europe and also exportable or sellable or applicable elsewhere. Same as my own definition that I've put on the screen a few times pretends to be valid for clearly other regions. And when I wrote it, I had in mind Central Asia, in fact, not Europe, but in retrospect, it also corresponds to Europe. All my life, I've tried to look at Asia from the point of view of Asia, even though I'm a European. Maybe I've failed, but at least I've tried. So. Yes?
Sir, thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. I have three small questions. Do you think that the enclaves which is situated in the different parts of Central Asia, especially for the ethnic regions, enclaves?
Enclaves, yes.
So, does it also having an impact of, certainly it is for their national living and for other things, but whether it is also a factor in your new Asia? Number one. Number two is, especially as you have already mentioned, the drug trafficking and religious radicalization. Drug trafficking and religious radicalization is also maybe a significant factor for New Asia.
Thank you very much. Is it possible to have the map and show the area that connects Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, not far from the Andijan Valley, but shows the borders having what we call in French a snail shell sort of shape, very intricate, and once they became international borders, they separated villages and families, communities, and some valleys, and that has created a socio-political issue of a real kind. It's difficult. Can you have an option where we have colors for countries or not on this system? Yeah. We no longer stand up. We use this now. Where's the border? Kyrgyzstan comes all the way down here, so to speak. Uzbekistan encroaches inside here, and Tajikistan is. So you have this area where the borders are absolutely impossible to manage in the sense of having, as I said, separated the local traditional geomorphological, sociological life. People find themselves having to have a passport in order to visit their relatives or to go and farm their land and come back home in the evening and cross the border. So this is a particular complicated situation that we should hope finds a way to be facilitated. In fact, in many regions of the world, you have sometimes a specific, what is it called, transborder pass, so to speak, so that people who live in one part and live somewhere else. This happens for people who work in Switzerland. They live in France, for example. They have a specific pass, they have a specific tax system, and so on to facilitate things. But this is a legacy of the past, and it will not go away. Borders will not change, I don't suppose, because these borders were established a long time ago. Unless I'm wrong, in the pre-Soviet times, already by the Russian colonizer. So why I smiled when I listened to your question is because I recently had an occasion where a geographer looked at an article written by a political scientist and criticized the article for being too general and vague in a sense, not taking into account this micro border problems. Whereas the article was on a macro construction of the region, and enclaves or exclaves are a characteristic of many parts of the world. If you look at the sources, there are hundreds of exclaves and enclaves, meaning portions of territories situated far from. This is even sort of more complex, situated outside the main territory. Of course, we have this situation with Armenia and Azerbaijan. We have it with Russia and Kaliningrad, and the world is full of such examples. You have two Spanish enclaves in Morocco. You have one British enclave in Spain. So these things are situations which create a lot of human difficulties and sometimes some local crises. But they are, how can I put it, less relevant directly to me when we look at the broad geopolitical reshaping of the region. I'm sure you have examples in your mind regarding your country or your region, which I'm not aware of. Drug trafficking and religious radicalization, there are different things. Drug trafficking is part of the coordinated police work. And obviously, one factor taken very seriously, not just because it concerns the perverse impact it has on the real economy, but because it affects certain territories more than others and traffics cross borders. So if it is the case that drugs originate in Afghanistan or in that part of the world, for one main location, there are other main locations in the world, then they cross 2, 3, 4 borders before they reach the European market. And so all those borders are problems that can create tensions among governments. So what has happened in that region is that the fight against illegal cross-border movements is now equated and conducted together, whether it is cross-border illegal radical movements or whether it is cross-border illegal drug trafficking movements, and all types of traffics, whether traffics of drugs, traffics of ideas, traffics of are taken together in the sense that the fight against terrorism, which is one priority of the Shanghai construction, is now a fight against terrorism and drug trafficking and all sorts of destabilizing factors. But so the means devoted to the fight against drug trafficking are extremely high and becoming higher and higher. The efficiency of the fight against drug trafficking, of course, is always limited. Now, the last point is interesting because what you call religious radicalization as a source of instability and danger, I think all regions have this sort of have a form of radicalization which threatens the cohesion of the nation state, whether it is religion or other ideas that threaten the cohesion of the nation state. Is one thing. I will take an example which is perhaps to use a surprising one, but the way in which in my country, France, there is a radicalization that could threaten the nation state, but in the following manner. The French Republic is based around one very simple concept, that the Republic is one and indivisible. And that is an overarching part of the Constitution, in the name of which we have limits to, for example, decentralization, autonomization. We cannot go as far as Spain, which has given almost lawmaking capacities to the autonomías, and we have limitations to deconcentration, decentralization, all the reforms that can bring decisions away from the center to the local level. And so we have at present a tendency to contest the unity of the Republic. That's what we call it, which is the same as the unity of the nation, but we call it the unity of the Republic, by the emergence of what we call communities that want to be recognized and affirmed by themselves. So we have economic communities, we have local communities, we have migrant communities, and insofar as they claim to have specificities that should be recognized by the state, perhaps by the acts of parliament, as different from the rest of the nation, we have a threat to the unity of the republic. So that's a form of non-religious radicalization that is intellectually relevant to your question. Of course, religious radicalization, in terms of what we are discussing, is the opposite of secularism, or a threat to the secular nature of the state and the constitution. And in Central Asia, all the constitutions are secular in that sense. They have borrowed in many, many ways, and not borrowed. They also echo what the French have called the separation of the state and the church, and the fact that the state is a secular construction. That religion is perfectly welcome. All religions are perfectly welcome in the case of France, but they are something separate from the state, from politics, from. I'm quite sure these terms mean different things in different nations. So I'm not going to go into the whole array of examples in the world, but what is common to all illustrations is the acceptance or reluctance to cohesion. Unity is what it's called, but cohesion or coherence. And so the challenges to unity, in that sense, exists in every country. Every country manages it differently. There is, in terms of constitutional law, the federal solution, to have a federal system where the states are recognized in one particular chamber, and in that sense, there is no disparity created by demographic imbalances. In Kazakhstan, interestingly, they have a parliamentary body which is called the Assembly of Nationalities, I think it is called. So it's not a second or third chamber of the main parliament, but it is a sort of parallel debating chamber where all nationalities, on the basis of one nationality equals one voice, or one vote, is present and represented, and can make a case for suggesting to amend the acts of parliament of the country to recognize, to foster or protect or whatever each nationality. 120 plus nationalities in a country with under 20 million inhabitants. So that's a huge diversity. And I find this example in Kazakhstan, I don't know whether the other countries have that, extremely interesting. And that they have a parliament in its own right, plus I think it's called the Assembly of Nationalities.
Thank you for your lecture, sir. Sir, since you are a visiting professor at one of Kazakhstan's major universities, my question is centered
Sorry, I missed the beginning.
My question is centered around Kazakhstan. Like Kazakhstan draws many parallels with Ukraine. About 18% of the population of Kazakhstan is Russian in ethnicity, and it lives in the northern parts of Kazakhstan. So, sir, basically, how imminent, according to you, is the threat of Russia violating Kazakhstan's territorial sovereignty, and how imminent it is in the mindset of the general Kazakh populace and the Kazakh policymakers?
Well, I'm not quite sure your question is entirely academic, but it's a difficult one to answer as you expect me to say. The elements of answer which I derive from academic analysis is that in the context of the new nation formation in the 1990s, certainly countries, when they could, and Kazakhstan did, reorganize themselves in order to symbolize or to signal or to establish a new form of existence. And so the symbol of that is a move of the capital city from Almaty to Astana, which you know, but I'm going to say a few things about this. This was decided in 1995 or 6, I think, or early on, which meant a massive, of course, urbanization and development of a village, I forgot the name of it, or a small town, which has now become Astana. The word Astana, incidentally, in the Kazakh language means the capital city. So it's a name that means the capital city. Anyway, and Alma-Ata, do you know what Alma-Ata means? Alma-Ata. Alma is apple, and Ata is father or grandfather or whatever. So this is where the fruits originated in the prehistoric times. Anyway, so the move of the capital symbolized and signaled. You could interpret it in many ways, in your way, if you see what I mean, or it could be interpreted as moving the capital of the new Kazakhstan, the land of the Kazakhs, where the Kazakhs were, technically speaking, in the transition period, less than 50% of the population. Quickly, of course, because of Russian emigration back to Russia and others, the ethnic Kazakh population became the majority one. But to signal that in a country of the Kazakhs, where the Kazakhs were, or the language, or the traditions, and the history were predominant, the capital was moved to a part of the country where the Russian speakers, or the Russian, or the ethnic Russians were more numerous, in order to take them into account and properly offer them, so to speak, the capital city, at the same time as making them from ethnic Russian Soviet citizens into ethnic Russian Kazakhstani citizens. So integrate them better. That's my answer to your question. I did leave open to you, yes. I left open to you the bilateral tensions, left open to you a number of points in my presentation today.
So you mentioned about Eurasian ambiguity in your lecture. So I would like to ask that how does the concept of Eurasia, or how do these 5 Central Asian countries see the concept of Eurasia or New Asia now? How does it vary for these 5 Central Asian countries? And even from the perspective of SCO, for example, Turkmenistan is not the member of SCO. So how do they see this?
Yes, thank you for your question, because it's the occasion for me to say that Eurasian, from the point of view of Central Asia, means in many ways their own centrality. They are super central to the concept of Eurasian. So it's one more conception and one more definition of Eurasia. We have the European one, we have the Russian one, we have the Southeast Asian one, we have the East Asian one to some extent. I'm still waiting for the South Asian or Indian definition of Eurasian. I'm becoming impatient. But Central Asia definitely has a sort of specific relation to the concept, because their history has made them, in many ways, quote unquote, Russians. Russia in history is very much a European actor back in the 19th and of course 18th and so on. So, but they are located very close. They are in Asia. They are Asians, and they are located very close to China, or to the west of China, which in some times of history was less relevant than the east of China, which was the center of power, the center of the economy. But the west of China has become now very relevant, and they're close to it. But they're really, in that sense, Central Asian and Eurasian. The two words can be equated as almost synonyms in that sense. I don't know whether Eurasia echoes something today as relevant and meaningful in the countries such as Turkey, for example, which is obviously Eurasian in many ways. And the first time you go to Istanbul, the thing we eat is, shall we have tea on the European side, or shall we have tea on the Asian side? And so this duality is very much present there. But in today's geopolitics of Turkey, Turkey is a new name, whether they feel more Asian is my analysis, in the sense of having been Asianized too. So yes, this is a term, Eurasia, which as we say in French, is called to a very thriving future, because it is a term that can be used without thinking much about it, or on the contrary, used to suggest, foster, and affirm some coherence or cohesion. And cohesion is one of my terms used to define a region. A region is a space made coherent or cohesed by a certain number of factors, and the symbolic ones of identity, definition, terminology are important ones. In other words, I borrowed this from one of my colleagues, was the moment we name a region, it exists. So if we call something Eurasia, there will be tendencies to make it exist and happen.
So, when Europe is a kind of geographical entity, but when you use the term European, because you said Russia is a European state, so what do you mean by
Yes,
so
yes.
there are several questions.
But the quick answer is that no,
I want the long
yes,
answer.
yeah, no, yes, but all terms must be defined. When I just said Russia is European, I meant in its political, diplomatic, military history of a certain period. My answers are always implicitly that.
What is European? Russia also wants to be a European country. Many of the European countries consider themselves to be European, but what is European?
I was going to say my answers are very rarely.
The answer is very hierarchical, and that's what I'm trying to question.
My answers are very rarely geographical or cartographic. This is yes. When I use the phrase,
that's Europe, not European. Cartographic answer. I'm saying European in normative terms.
What's the difference between Europe and European in that sense?
Europe
for you?
Can be defined as a geographical entity where there is a combination of entities, combination of states.
No, I think
but
if
when you say something European, so what is European?
no, when we say European or Europe or Asia or Asian, and we mean geography and cartography, the two terms come together. If we mean geopolitics or diplomacy or military history, we mean something else. When I just used the phrase Russia and European, I did mean that Russia was part of European alliances in the period 18th, 19th century, with some and against others, and with shifting alliances. So in that sense, that period of Russian history is European. I didn't mean that Russia was European in geographic terms and so on. I also said that the Russian idea of Eurasia is specific, and it's been revived at present. You had this Russian thinker who came to give a lecture, Dugin. So you have a number of authors, Dugin today, Gumilov some time back, and other authors going back 1 century at least, who worked on the Russian conception of Eurasia. And there's been an evolution in that history of the term, and that history does not coincide with the Russian, Soviet, and so on periods. It coincides with the more deeper movement of the political thought. But as far as I understand, in a sense, Eurasia meant or can mean for Russia being both European and Asian. In that sense, a crossroad or a go-between or a mediator and an almost automatic enhanced role. Or Eurasia can mean being, quote unquote, neither European nor Asian, but Russian, specifically Russian, which makes it possible to then justify national or nationalist attitude and positions. Or Eurasian can mean, in the sense of Eurasian Economic Union, a specific entity with others, not with China, with others, and perhaps the ambiguity is whether Eurasian in that sense is an echo of the Soviet times, when the republics were, not all of them, but many of them, in the Eurasian space in a sense, and so the left being, they're no longer in the Soviet Union, they're no longer in the CIS, but they are now in the Eurasian Economic Union. Basically Russia, the Caucasians, and some of the Central Asian states. So that's my point, that the term is, I don't like the word ambiguous, that the term Eurasian is, polysemic. It has a number of meanings which are different. But to what extent, okay, let me be more direct. To what extent can the word Eurasian mean something for South Asia? Okay, not to you, but to
It has different meanings. Historically, some of the people say that from Arctic till South Asia, it should be Eurasia. and they have written in the historical period.
North to south.
From Arctic
Yes.
here.
So north to south. But what about east to west?
Entire spaces. And then, there are people who follow the imperial history and they still quote Mackinder and all. So, and that's Mackinder was basically imperialist geographer. So they consider what Heartland, etc., that theory to be Eurasian. And now we in our center, because we are also trying to change the name of the center, so we consider the former Soviet space to be the Eurasia, and we do not include Turkey in that. So that's what, and we do not include Iran in that. So that's what we consider. At least in our center, we consider Eurasia as that.
But Turkey and Iran are very much a part of Eurasia.
Yeah. So we are, yeah.
Yes.
It's an evolving concept.
I think on the one hand, the discussion about names of regions is necessary, but it's an endless one unless we specify the factors. Yes. If we talk about the geopolitical construction of organizations, then we can suggest membership of an organization is relevant to the definition of a space, although membership is open. So membership can be extended to a country's citizenship as well. Another way of approaching the issue is to suggest that one term like Eurasia makes sense by contrast to what is what is not Eurasian. But if what is not Eurasian is, for example, the Middle East or North Africa or East Africa, the rest being or even perhaps you could suggest that some parts of is a South Pacific Eurasian, for example, is a South Pacific Asian, yes, in terms of trading agreements and everything else. But so even if we proceed by defining something, but by what is not that something, we're up against the fact that membership changes. And so if tomorrow countries such as Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt become members of the SCO in that sense goes beyond Eurasia, however we define Eurasia. So membership is a limited factor. So we have to accept from the start that whatever we try to do by way of definition will be imperfect, will be insufficient.
Yes. And can you just elaborate for the benefit of the student, because you use those terms from the methodological point of view. You have used the term counterfactual, you have used the term epistemology. So if you can, because I want to understand the French perspective. Please elaborate ontology, epistemology, and methodology, and also counterfactuals for the benefit of the students.
Well, counterfactual.
And how we can use in our research. So please tell.
The counterfactual approach is the a contrario approach, meaning the approach of phenomenon through its opposites. So the what if not approach, by contrast to the what if approach, is trying to, the what if approach attempts to relate causes, consequences, or links, or to link together factors of explanation. The what if not approach is an approach that suggests that we should also look at what did not happen and why it did not happen, or had it happened, the impact it would have had on the phenomena we are looking at.
When do you use counterfactuals, please?
Well, as I've just done for this region, I say what would have happened if there had not been
Causation, right?
Yes.
Yes.
If there had not been the Shanghai construction, if there had not been the post-Cold War or the end of the Cold War, if there had not been the Soviet Empire, what would Asia be today if there had not been colonization of Southeast Asia, South Asia, and so on? This is the counterfactual approach. And of course, it raises questions to which we do not have the answer, but it puts factors and causes and consequences in perspective. Epistemology, I use the term many times to suggest a reflection upon the validity of knowledge. When we produce science, we produce knowledge. What is the validity of that knowledge? If it's objective, if it's demonstrated knowledge that we produce and that we offer our readers, then the validity is high. If it's a biased analysis, if it's insufficiently factorialized analysis, then it is of a lesser validity. There are many more things to say, but the validity of knowledge is based also on the capacity to pass the test of refutability. in Kuhnian approach. So if you can refute something, even if you prove that it is wrong, you are not challenging its scientificity, which is something the mathematicians do a lot. They can prove something wrong, but it is still scientific fact proven wrong. Don't let me go too far or pretend that I could go further. But this is what epistemology means in my mind. That we have to establish knowledge and truth. We have to expose rationality, and then that or question the validity of what we've exposed. So what I'm trying to expose is the fact that faced with the question of what to do in 1991, 1992, the countries that we have mentioned adopted an attitude of common creation of a new dynamism, where every step taken, some of them very difficult, was almost immediately conceived as one step among many to be taken. And so this is why I often say I'm neither a geographer nor a historian, but I borrow from those disciplines, from sociology, certain elements. From geography, of course, cartography comes into play, and you can spend hours when when we can't sleep at night. You can look at a map and look at certain positions. We did yesterday for a few borders, and sort of look at them and realize how much intensity is packed in just a few kilometers. When I was a student, I wanted to write my master's thesis, but I didn't, on the border that connected the USSR and Norway, for example, up in the north. Since then, of course, there is a TV series, which I hope you have watched. It's called Occupied. And the scenario is one whereby the Russians take over Norway and the Norwegian oil and energy and so on and so forth. And interestingly enough, in the scenario, NATO no longer exists. The EU is the military capacity eventually to intervene, doesn't intervene, of course, and so on and so forth. So that particular border, which is not very long, it's up in the Arctic and it's frozen all year round. It's a very specific one. So we looked at. From history, I often mention dates, and when I mention dates, I do so because they are landmarks, and they're necessary landmarks. Often I prefer to specific dates, periods, where things change and evolve. But my reasoning is on the shifting power factors that come into play to create certain dynamics now and then. But dates, I mean, there is it's in French though, but there is a very nice YouTube program by a famous professor from the Collège de France, which is the top French intellectual institution. And the title is When History Makes Dates, so to speak. So he takes a date and explains how a date is always totally relevant to some extent, but a date focalizes attention and accelerates our need to understand what has happened. But what has happened, of course, precedes and supersedes the date itself. I always ask my students at some point in my classes, when did the Cold War begin? Or when do you date the end of the Cold War? And they all say 1991. Full stop. And to me, it's not 1991. It's a period that goes from 1985 to 1998. Why 85? Because that's the assumption to power of Mikhail Gorbachev, trying to reform the system, and the attempt to reform exposes the weaknesses of the system and so on. And also other contextual elements come into play. And 98 is the nuclear tests by India and Pakistan, which to me symbolize, echo, substantiate the shifting capacity of some of the world to dictate their terms, through notably the non-proliferation treaty. Someone referred to a treaty of that sort, I think yesterday or 2 days ago. Was it you or somebody else? And I think I heard that what was mentioned was the non-proliferation treaty of 1968, but I'm not sure. But anyway, so the end of the Cold War for me is 13 years. I mean, a good decade, so to speak, and definitely the post-Cold War begins in 1992, not 1991, because it was December, and by the time things things were affected by the end of the Cold War. It took some time. Some of the earliest effects of the end of the Cold War is the Chinese-South Korean trade, which sort of exponentially boomed in 1 year between the end of 1991 to 1993. Is this enough comment on?
Hello, Professor. My question is like very much related to what you just spoke, and maybe sir and ma'am can help it elaborate it further, because it's going to a bit of philosophical normative, because it's on the counterfactual theme which you said that we can imagine, like we can go ahead with the question, what if SEO would not have been there? I am very highly doubtful that my very dumb argument for that is, when we say what if SEO wouldn't have been there, we are very optimistic about that, getting positive results and getting achievements of SEO. What we are missing is, I guess, we are focusing on the fact that what if SEO would not have been there, but what we are also missing, that we can't imagine what would have been there in place of SEO. An example which I can currently think of is that when we say that what if this lecture series of 10-day course on Eurasia would not have been there, okay, I found myself devoid of all this knowledge and intellect, but what I can't think of that what would have happened in place of that. I am not very sure if I can take you to the level which I am on, which is not very high, I am very sure. But what I'm telling you is that I'm very sure if I would have missed these 10 days, I would have been devoid of this Eurasian intellect and whatever we have discussed. So that's a minus point. But what we cannot do as humans is think of something which would have been there in place of that. Very simply, if I would have missed that 10 lectures, minus point for this Eurasian intellect, but let's suppose, what if I would have found something present on the road? Or if I would have met the Prime Minister? Or what if I would have found the God? Maybe. So at the normative level, is it the right stuff to imagine what if SEO wouldn't have been there? Simply it is, because I'm very optimistic if SEO wouldn't have been there would not have been this much possibilities. But is it scientifically correct? I would like to ask.
Well, who am I to judge the scientificity of what you're suggesting? What I can say is that, in a sense, the answer to your question is very simple. Had the SEO not been in existence, there are other dynamics which were already at play before, some that were picked up afterwards, and they would have somehow produced a movement which I see as the characteristic of post-war contexts. I see a link between scientific, or at least a causality link between post-war and region building among neighbors becoming partners. Whether it's post-colonial war or independence, whether it's post-World War or whether it's post-Cold War. And this is why, in a diachronic manner, not in a synchronic manner, but in diachronic manner, the European construction and the Asian construction are both post-war dynamics in the context. So in your region, I mentioned in my opening speech and in my lectures, a dozen or 2 dozens of organizations that exist, that pre-existed the end of the Cold War, or were created since, or were reactivated. And you know many of them. I'm going to forget some if I mention them. But you have SICA, you have the Eurasian Economic Union, you have the CSTO, you have SAARC, you have ASEAN, you have Organization for Turkic-speaking countries, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, the European Union, the European. All these organizations were in place, would have been created, or different ones, and somehow there would have been a way in which countries no longer would pursue an independent national course, or nationalistic course, with exceptions of countries closing in, Turkmenistan in its way, North Korea in its way, so on. But even they are becoming more interactive with neighbors in their own particular way. So my contention is that there would have been something else happening instead of the SEO. But why was there a strong rationale for the emergence of the SCO, specifically as the management of border tensions or potential border conflicts between China and the four ex-Soviet neighbors, Russia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, is because the risk of escalation was high, and because the awareness, by the Chinese in particular, that they had to preempt any front on land at that border in order to make their post-78 commercial maritime insertion in the world possible. They were opening a maritime commercial front. They could not afford two fronts. And Deng Xiaoping said so in 1978. I'm trying to find the exact quotation of the exact newspaper or speech in which he said so, but he said, China needs peace at her borders for 50 years. 50 years is a grand sort of duration, which means the long term, the certainty of peace, but at the borders. By which he meant, I'm quite certain, I can't ask him now, but I'm certain he meant land borders with Central Asia, or with the at the time Soviet space. And there were attempts at that. There were meetings among Chinese and Soviet officials in the 80s. In particular after 86 or 85, 86, because Gorbachev in many ways opened a number of situations, he eased situations, not just the reforms he tried, Glasnost and Perestroika, he also changed the Soviet management of communities and religions in the Soviet Union. He tried to, not normalize yet, but at least to retable certain discussions with China, and the borders were one of them. It didn't succeed until after 1991, but it was tried. So there was, I'm trying to find the right word, there was a natural trend towards a change. So if it hadn't been the SCO, it might have been called something, the Shanghai Five could have remained and not be transformed into the SCO with non-contiguous actors, Uzbekistan and then others, and non-ambitioning to go beyond border peace and into economic cooperation. The Shanghai Five could have continued for decades as a border management or border control body, or somehow a monitoring of military agreements. As I said to you, the fundamental military agreements among those countries were signed before 2001. They were signed under the time period of the Shanghai Five, so they could have continued. Madam.
This is just your opinions, if multilateralism would not have existed, so how would have affected the world order dynamics?
Wow,
Just your views.
even more complex
Open-ended.
question. I think multilateralism was again an unavoidable, logical dynamic that would have taken place irrespective of almost everything else, except that we've gone from a period of dominant and almost exclusive world multilateralism, the UN and all its meaning. It's a huge, when we go back to the late 40s, the creation of the UN, the world, and all the associated institutions is a huge step forward in terms of world governance and peace, however limited it proved to be. We've gone from that global multilateralism to regional multilateralism. And the world today is characterized, in my analysis, and I think I'm very clear about this. The world system is made up of regional multilateralism and inter-regional multilateralism, which used to be called trans-regional, and which now is called inter-regional. Words change. The world governance and the world stage has proved very limited in terms of its efficiency. And as I've said to you last week, unless I'm wrong, there have not been any creations of world-level organizations, and all the ones that exist are within the UN. Am I wrong or right? The World Bank is a UN thing. The IMF is also within the and the WTO and so on. So something else would have happened. But thank you for your provocative question, echoing my own pretension to make sense. We meet today for essays going back to you, and Friday for the last moment.
Anybody who has not turned in the essay, please give it to us. Today is the last day.
And promise me, but I will say it again when I have the floor on the essay topic, no longer to ever say or write China, Russia, and the others. So I've written in red ink with a question mark, on all essays. Please quote Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, exclamation mark. And some of you are not up to date. Some of you refer to the 8-member SCO. So it's 10-member. Just joking.
Everybody, so tomorrow we meet again. Can we come for a group photograph? Come forward, please.
So I always say no and then I say yes, so I should be more specific. Let me go to my notes. Tomorrow is the...